My talk is about mud, that wet, slimy substance that you're familiar with that forms when dirt comes in contact with water. Mud can be great fun at the 4th of July mud race, as you see here, but there are also scientific reasons to be interested in mud. My students and colleagues and I study the mud that accumulates at the bottoms of lakes and in other wetlands to learn about those water bodies and the surrounding environment. So we make these Huck Finn type rafts and go out to different sites and very carefully collect the mud that has often quite slowly accumulated in those depressions. So using a variety of sediment cores that all come down to an empty tube, we start at the top of the sediments, collect the first meter, then the next meter, then the next meter, until we're at the bottom of the deposits or until all my students have mutinied. We have, at some of our sites, we're able to extrude the sediments in the field. That means we can look at what we've actually got. This is what we're doing here in a wetland in North Carolina, and I'm smiling because I'm pointing to a piece of wood. Wood is very nice material for radiocarbon dating, so we can know how old the mud is, and I'm actually pointing to a piece that I can tell you we now know is approximately 12,000 years old. Some of our other cores come back to the lab, still encased in the aluminum tubes in which we collected them, and then we slice open the tubes, slice apart the cores, photograph them, and begin to sample a variety of different components in the mud that can tell us what we want to know about the history of our core sites. We're very interested in the vegetation history, the fire history, the disturbance history, and the climate history. Now, sometimes the fire and vegetation and disturbance is all related to the activities of people. Other times we're looking at changes driven by climate change and natural disturbances that, depending on the time frame of our records, might have affected the human societies. So what we're doing is we're looking at clues in the mud. The scientific term would be proxy indicators, but these are clues that tell us about past conditions. I want to take you to several of our study sites and show you what we're learning from mud that perhaps you'd be surprised we can learn from this substance. First of all, we're going to go to the mountains of Costa Rica, which were repeatedly glaciated in the last 500,000 or so years. It turns out that the mud that accumulates at the bottoms of lakes and wetlands up there at high elevation gives us wonderful information about conditions during those time periods and about the timing of when there was ice and when there wasn't ice. The key thing to look at is the mud that accumulates right on top of the glacial floor, the broken up rock material left by the glaciers. If we get a lot of radiocarbon dates on that material from a lot of sites, we can tell you when ice last left the massif or when it came back in earlier periods. Here's a muddy site here in Tennessee. This is Anderson Pond on the Highland Rim. Former University of Tennessee professors Hazel and Paul Delcourt did a lot of work there in the 1970s, and my students and I are doing more work now. What Paul and Hazel were particularly interested in were the pollen grains that have accumulated in the mud at this site on the Highland Rim and what they could tell us about past vegetation. Different types of plants produce different types of pollen, and you can identify the type of plant represented. So by looking at the different abundances of pollen grains, we can say something about past vegetation, and from that infer something about past climate. Now, the interesting finding was that during the last glacial period, say about 18,000 years ago, the vegetation right here in Tennessee showed some similarities with the boreal forest of Canada, which is what you see here. It didn't look just like this, but a whole lot more spruce and fir and northern pines than could grow at that particular site in today's climate. Sometimes in our studies, it's one particular plant that captures our fancy, and that's the situation with corn or maize in our work in Central and South America and the Caribbean. Maize is a wonderful indicator of human activity, of prehistoric agriculture, of the movement of people and ideas, and it also is a very good local indicator of the presence of people because corn plants don't grow themselves. And in fact, in Costa Rica, the maize pollen we found in all 3 archaeological zones actually predates any of the archaeological evidence. So it's great to help our archaeologist colleagues know where they might want to start doing some excavations. Another indicator in the sediments that can tell us about past agriculture are the stable carbon isotope signatures. If you have a lake surrounded by tropical rainforest, you get an isotopic structure from C3 plants. But if you clear that forest and replace it with corn and agricultural weeds, you get a different isotopic signature in the mud. So it's another one of those clues that can tell us about the history of environments. We spend a lot of time also looking at charcoal, microscopic pieces, and the bigger pieces. We like the bigger pieces because sometimes we can say, hey, that's a piece of pine charcoal, or that's a piece of oak charcoal, and then we learn even more. In the next slide that's coming up here, we're coring a site in the Florida Keys. This is on Big Pine Key with work sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who are very interested in the history of fire and in the charcoal we can study. This solution hole is so small we can't fit my Huck Finn raft in it, so we built a ladder and we're coring from the ladder into the solution hole below. The Fish and Wildlife Service knows from recent ecological studies and our own work with tree rings that in the last few decades and centuries there have been a lot of fires in this pine rockland vegetation, and that those fires are really important to managing habitat for the key deer. This is in the National Key Deer Refuge. The problem is a lot of local landowners who have a very different view. They view fire as detrimental, a problem for the forest and for the deer, and they'd just as soon have the Fish and Wildlife Service pack up and go home. So the idea was, what can we learn from the mud? And to end my talk and cut to the chase, I'll tell you that in the past 1,600 years at the site that you're seeing the data coming up next, we have abundant pine pollen and abundant macroscopic charcoal, much of it from pine trees, showing a very long relationship between pine and fire and really validating the prescribed fire work that our colleagues in the Fish and Wildlife Service are doing. So I hope I've given you a better appreciation for mud than you've had before, and I thank you very much for your attention.